The Moon is Green by Fritz Leiber. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. 3 by Fritz Leiber. The Moon is Green. Anybody who wanted to escape death could, by paying a very simple price: denial of life.
Effie, what the devil are you up to?
Her husband's voice, chopping through her mood of terrified rapture, made her heart jump like a startled cat. Yet, by some miracle of feminine self-control, her body did not show a tremor. Dear God, she thought, he mustn't see it. It's so beautiful, and he always kills beauty. I'm just looking at the moon, she said listlessly. It's green. Mustn't see it. And now with luck he wouldn't, for the face, as if it also heard and sensed the menace in the voice, was moving back from the window's glow into the outside dark, but slowly, reluctantly, and still fawn-like, pleading, cajoling, tempting, and incredibly beautiful. Close the shutters at once, you little fool, and come away from the window. Green as a beer bottle, she went on dreamily. Green as emeralds, green as leaves with sunshine striking through them, and green grass to lie on. She couldn't help saying those last words. They were her token to the face, even though it couldn't hear. Effie! She knew what that last tone meant. Wearily she swung shut the ponderous lead inner shutters and drove home the heavy bolts. That hurt her fingers. It always did, but he mustn't know that. You know that those shutters are not to be touched. Not for 5 more years at least. I only wanted to look at the moon, she said, turning around, and then it was all gone. The face, the night, the moon, the magic. And she was back in the grubby, stale little hole, facing an angry, stale little man. It was then that the eternal thud of the air-conditioning fans and the crackle of the electrostatic precipitators that sieved out the dust reached her consciousness again, like the bite of a dentist's drill. "Only wanted to look at the moon," he mimicked her in falsetto. "Only wanted to die like a little fool, and make me that much more ashamed of you." Then his voice went gruff and professional. "Here, count yourself." She silently took the Geiger counter he held at arm's length, waited until it settled down to a steady ticking slower than a clock, due only to cosmic rays and indicating nothing dangerous, and then began to comb her body with the instrument. First her head and shoulders, then out along her arms and back along their underside. There was something oddly voluptuous about her movements, although her features were gray and sagging. The ticking did not change its tempo until she came to her waist. Then it suddenly spurted, clicking faster and faster. Her husband gave an excited grunt, took a quick step forward, froze. She goggled for a moment in fear, then grinned foolishly, dug in the pocket of her grimy apron, and guiltily pulled out a wristwatch. He grabbed it as it dangled from her fingers, saw that it had a radium dial, cursed, heaved it up as if to smash it on the floor, but instead put it carefully on the table. "You imbecile, you incredible imbecile," he softly chanted to himself through clenched teeth, with eyes half closed. She shrugged faintly, put the Geiger counter on the table, and stood there, slumped. He waited until the chanting had soothed his anger before speaking again. He said quietly, I do suppose you still realize the sort of world you're living in? She nodded slowly, staring at nothingness. Oh, she realized all right. Realized only too well. It was the world that hadn't realized. The world had gone on stockpiling hydrogen bombs. The world that had put those bombs in cobalt shells, although it had promised it wouldn't, because cobalt made them much more terrible and cost no more. The world that had started throwing those bombs, always telling itself that it hadn't thrown enough of them yet to make the air really dangerous with the deadly radioactive dust that came from the cobalt. Thrown them and kept on throwing until the danger point, where air and ground would become fatal to all human life, was approached. Then, for about a month, the two great enemy groups had hesitated, and then, unknown to the other, had decided it could risk one last gigantic and decisive attack without exceeding the danger point. It had been planned to strip off the cobalt cases, but someone forgot, and then there wasn't time. Besides, the military scientists of each group were confident that the lands of the other had got the most dust. The two attacks came within an hour of each other. After that, the fury. The fury of doomed men who think only of taking with them as many as possible of the enemy, and in this case they hoped all. The fury of suicides who know they had botched up life for good. The fury of cocksure men who realize they have been outsmarted by fate, the enemy, and themselves, and know that they will never be able to improvise a defense when arraigned before the high court of history, and whose unadmitted hope is that there will be no high court of history left to arraign them. More cobalt bombs were dropped during the fury than in all the preceding years of the war. After the fury, the terror. Men and women with death sifting into their bones through their nostrils and skin, fighting for bare survival under a dust-hazed sky that played fantastic tricks with the light of sun and moon, like the dust from Krakatoa that drifted around the world for years. Cities, countryside, and air were alike poisoned, alive with deadly radiation. The only realistic chance for continued existence was to retire. For the 5 or 10 years the radiation would remain deadly, to some well-sealed and radiation-shielded place that must be copiously supplied with food, water, power, and a means of air conditioning. Such places were prepared by the far-seeing, seized by the stronger, defended by them in turns against the desperate hordes of the dying, until there were no more of those. After that, only the waiting, the enduring. A mole's existence, without beauty or tenderness, but with fear and guilt as constant companions. Never to see the sun, to walk among the trees, or even to know if there were still trees. Oh, yes, she realized what the world was like. You understand, too, I suppose, that we were allowed to reclaim this ground-level apartment only because the committee believed us to be responsible people, and because I've been making a damn good showing lately? Yes, Hank. I thought you were eager for privacy. You want to go back to the basement tenements? God, no. Anything rather than that fetid huddling, that shameless communal sprawl. And yet, was this so much better? The nearness to the surface was meaningless. It only tantalized, and the privacy magnified Hank. She shook her head dutifully and said, "No, Hank." "Then why aren't you careful? I've told you 1,000,000 times, Effie, that glass is no protection against the dust that's outside the window. The lead shutter must never be touched. If you make one single slip like that and it gets around, the committee will send us back to the lower levels without blinking an eye, and they'll think twice before trusting me with any important jobs. I'm sorry, Hank." "Sorry? What's the good of being sorry? The only thing that counts is never to make a slip. Why the devil do you do such things, Effie? What drives you to it?" She swallowed. "It's just that it's so dreadful being cooped up like this," she said hesitatingly. "Shut away from the sky and the sun. I'm just hungry for a little beauty." "And do you suppose I'm not?" he demanded. "Don't you suppose I want to get outside, too, and be carefree and have a good time? But I'm not so damn selfish about it. I want my children to enjoy the sun and my children's children. Don't you see that that's the all-important thing, and that we have to behave like mature adults and make sacrifices for it?" "Yes, Hank." He surveyed her slumped figure, her lined and listless face. "You're a fine one to talk about hunger for beauty," he told her. Then his voice grew softer and more deliberate. "You haven't forgotten, have you, Effie, that until last month the committee was so concerned about your sterility that they were about to enter my name on the list of those waiting to be allotted a free woman? Very high on the list, too." She could nod even at that one, but not while looking at him. She turned away. She knew very well that the committee was justified in worrying about the birth rate. When the community finally moved back to the surface again, each additional healthy young person would be an asset, not only in the struggle for bare survival, but in the resumed war against communism which some of the committee members still counted on. It was natural that they should view a sterile woman with disfavor, not only because of the waste of her husband's germplasm, but because sterility might indicate that she had suffered more than the average from radiation. In that case, if she did bear children later on, they would be more apt to carry a defective heredity, producing an undue number of monsters and freaks in future generations, and so contaminating the race. Of course she understood it. She could hardly remember the time when she didn't. Years ago, centuries, there wasn't much difference in a place where time was endless. His lecture finished, her husband smiled and grew almost cheerful. "Now that you're going to have a child, that's all in the background again. Do you know, Effie, that when I first came in, I had some very good news for you? I'm to become a member of the junior committee, and the announcement will be made at the banquet tonight." He cut short her numbed congratulations. "So brighten up and put on your best dress. I want the other juniors to see what a handsome wife the new member has got." He paused. "Well, get a move on." She spoke with difficulty, still looking at him. "I'm terribly sorry, Hank, but you'll have to go alone. I'm not well." He straightened up with an indignant jerk. "There you go again. First that infantile, inexcusable business of the shutters, and now this. No feeling for my reputation at all. Don't be ridiculous, Effie. You're coming." "Terribly sorry," she repeated blindly, "but I really can't. I'd just be sick. I wouldn't make you proud of me at all." "Of course you won't," he retorted sharply. "As it is, I have to spend half my energy running around making excuses for you. Why you're so odd, why you always seem to be ailing, why you're always stupid and snobbish and say the wrong thing. But tonight's really important, Effie. It will cause a lot of bad comment if the new member's wife isn't present. You know how just a hint of sickness starts the old radiation disease rumor going. You've got to come, Effie." She shook her head helplessly. "Oh, for heaven's sake, come on," he shouted, advancing on her. "This is just a silly mood. As soon as you get going, you'll snap out of it. There's nothing really wrong with you at all." He put his hand on her shoulder to turn her around, and at his touch her face suddenly grew so desperate and gray that for a moment he was alarmed in spite of himself. "Really?" he asked, almost with a note of concern. She nodded miserably. "Huh." He stepped back and strode about irresolutely. "Well, of course, if that's the way it is." He checked himself, and a sad smile crossed his face. "So you don't care enough about your old husband's success to make one supreme effort in spite of feeling bad?" Again the helpless headshake. "I just can't go out tonight under any circumstances." And her gaze stole toward the lead shutters. He was about to say something when he caught the direction of her gaze. His eyebrows jumped. For seconds he stared at her incredulously, as if some completely new and almost unbelievable possibility had popped into his mind. The look of incredulity slowly faded, to be replaced by a harder, more calculating expression. But when he spoke again, his voice was shockingly bright and kind. "Well, it can't be helped, naturally, and I certainly wouldn't want you to go if you weren't able to enjoy it. So you hop right into bed and get a good rest. I'll run over to the men's dorm to freshen up. No, really, I don't want you to have to make any effort at all. Incidentally, Jim Barnes isn't going to be able to come to the banquet either. Touch of the old flu, he tells me, of all things." He watched her closely as he mentioned the other man's name, but she didn't react noticeably. In fact, she hardly seemed to be hearing his chatter. "I got a bit sharp with you, I'm afraid, Effie," he continued contritely. "I'm sorry about that. I was excited about my new job, and I guess that was why things upset me. Make me feel let down when I found you weren't feeling as good as I was. Selfish of me. Now, you get into bed right away and get well. Don't worry about me a bit. I know you'd come if you possibly could, and I know you'll be thinking about me. Well, I must be off now." He started toward her as if to embrace her, then seemed to think better of it. He turned back to the doorway and said, emphasizing the words, "You'll be completely alone for the next 4 hours." He waited for her nod, then bounced out. She stood still until his footsteps died away. Then she straightened up, walked over to where he'd put down the wristwatch, picked it up and smashed it hard on the floor. The crystal shattered, the case flew apart, and something went zing. She stood there, breathing heavily. Slowly her sagged features lifted, formed themselves into the beginning of a smile. She stole another look at the shutters. The smile became more definite. She felt her hair, wet her fingers, and ran them along her hairline and back over her ears. After wiping her hands on her apron, she took it off. She straightened her dress, lifted her head with a little flourish, and stepped smartly toward the window. Then her face went miserable again, and her steps slowed. No, it couldn't be, and it won't be, she told herself. It had been just an illusion, a silly romantic dream that she had somehow projected out of her beauty-starved mind and given a moment's false reality. There couldn't be anything alive outside. There hadn't been for 2 whole years. And if there conceivably were, it would be something altogether horrible. She remembered some of the pariahs, hairless, witless creatures, with radiation welts crawling over their bodies like worms, who had come begging for succor during the last months of the Terror and been shot down. How they must have hated the people in refuges. But even as she was thinking these things, her fingers were caressing the bolts, gingerly drawing them, and she was opening the shutters gently, apprehensively. No, there couldn't be anything outside, she assured herself wryly. peering out into the green night. Even her fears had been groundless. But the face came floating up toward the window. She started back in terror, then checked herself, for the face wasn't horrible at all, only very thin, with full lips and large eyes and a thin, proud nose like a jutting beak of a bird. And no radiation welts or scars marred the skin, olive in the tempered moonlight. It looked, in fact, just as it had when she had seen it the first time. For a long moment the face stared deep, deep into her brain. Then the full lips smiled, and a half-clenched, thin-fingered hand materialized itself from the green darkness and rapped twice on the grimy pane. Her heart pounding, she furiously worked the little crank that opened the window. It came unstuck from the frame with a tiny explosion of dust and a zing like that of the watch, only louder. A moment later it swung open wide, and a puff of incredibly fresh air caressed her face and the inside of her nostrils, stinging her eyes with unanticipated tears. The man outside balanced on the sill, crouching like a fawn, head high, one elbow on knee. He was dressed in scarred, snug trousers and an old sweater. "Is it tears I get for a welcome?" he mocked her gently in a musical voice. "Or are those only to greet God's own breath, the air?" He swung down inside, and now she could see he was tall. Turning, he snapped his fingers and called, "Come, puss." A black cat with a twisted stump of a tail, and feet like small boxing gloves, and ears almost as big as a rabbit's, hopped clumsily in view. He lifted it down, gave it a pat. Then, nodding familiarly to Effie, he unstrapped a little pack from his back and laid it on the table. She couldn't move. She even found it hard to breathe. "The window," she finally managed to get out. He looked at her inquiringly, caught the direction of her stabbing finger. Moving without haste, he went over and closed it carelessly. "The shutters, too," she told him, but he ignored that, looking around. "It's a snug enough place you and your man have," he commented. "Or is it that this is a free-love town, or a harem spot, or just a military post?" He checked her before she could answer. "But let's not be talking about such things now. Soon enough I'll be scared to death for both of us. Best enjoy the kick of meeting, which is always good for 20 minutes at the least." He smiled at her rather shyly. "Have you food? Good, then bring it." She set cold meat and some precious canned bread before him, and had water heating for coffee. Before he fell to, he shredded a chunk of meat and put it on the floor for the cat, which left off its sniffing inspection of the walls and ran up eagerly, mewing. Then the man began to eat, chewing each mouthful slowly and appreciatively. From across the table, Effie watched him, drinking in his every deft movement, his every cryptic quirk of expression. She attended to making the coffee, but that took only a moment. Finally, she could contain herself no longer. "What's it like up there?" she asked breathlessly. "Outside, I mean." He looked at her oddly for quite a space. Finally, he said flatly, "Oh, it's a wonderland for sure. More amazing than you tombed folk could ever imagine. A veritable fairyland." And he quickly went on eating. "No, but really," she pressed. Noting her eagerness, he smiled, and his eyes filled with playful tenderness. "I mean it, on my oath," he assured her. "You think the bombs and the dust made only death and ugliness? Well, that was true at first, but then, just as the doctors foretold, they changed the life in the seeds and loins that were brave enough to stay. Wonders bloomed and walked." He broke off suddenly and asked, "Do any of you ever venture outside?" A few of the men are allowed to, she told him, for short trips in special protective suits to hunt for canned food and fuels and batteries and things like that. Aye, and those blind-souled slugs would never see anything but what they're looking for, he said, nodding bitterly. They'd never see the garden where a dozen buds blossom where one did before, and the flowers have petals a yard across, with stingless bees big as sparrows gently supping their nectar. House cats grown spotted and huge as leopards, not little runts like Joe Louis here, stalk through those gardens, but they're gentle beasts, no more harmful than the rainbow-scaled snakes that glide around their paws, for the dust burned all the murder out of them as it burned itself out. I've even made up a little poem about that. It starts, "Fire can hurt me, or water, or the weight of earth, but the dust is my friend. Oh, yes, and then the robins like cockatoos and squirrels like princesses ermine, all under a treasure chest of sun and moon and stars that the dust's magic powder changes from ruby to emerald and sapphire and amethyst and back again. Oh, and then the new children—" "You're telling the truth?" she interrupted him, her eyes brimming with tears. "You're not making it up?" "I am not," he assured her solemnly. "And if you could catch a glimpse of one of the new children, you'd never doubt me again. They have long limbs as brown as this coffee would be if it had lots of fresh cream in it, and smiling, delicate faces, and the whitest teeth and the finest hair. They're so nimble that I, a sprightly man and somewhat enlivened by the dust, feel like a cripple beside them. And their thoughts dance like flames and make me feel a very imbecile. Of course, they have 7 fingers on each hand and 8 toes on each foot, but they're the more beautiful for that. They have large, pointed ears that the sun shines through. They play in the garden all day long, slipping among the great leaves and blooms, but they're so swift that you can hardly see them, unless one chooses to stand still and look at you. For that matter, you have to look a bit hard for all these things I'm telling you." "But is it true?" she pleaded. "Every word of it," he said, looking straight into her eyes. He put down his knife and fork. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Mine's Patrick." "Effie," she told him. He shook his head. "That can't be," he said. Then his face brightened. "Euphemia," he exclaimed. "That's what Effie is short for. Your name is Euphemia." As he said that, looking at her, she suddenly felt beautiful. He got up and came around the table and stretched out his hand toward her. "Euphemia," he began. "Yes," she answered huskily, shrinking from him a little, but looking up sideways and very flushed. "Don't either of you move," Hank said. The voice was flat and nasal, because Hank was wearing a nose respirator that was just long enough to suggest an elephant's trunk. In his right hand was a large, blue-black automatic pistol. They turned their faces to him. Patrick's was abruptly alert, shifty, but Effie's was still smiling tenderly, as if Hank could not break the spell of the magic garden and should be pitied for not knowing about it. "You little—" Hank began with an almost gleeful fury, calling her several shameful names. He spoke in short phrases, closing tight his unmasked mouth between them while he sucked in breath through the respirator. His voice rose in a crescendo. "And not with a man of the community, but a pariah. A pariah!" "I hardly know what you're thinking, man, but you're quite wrong," Patrick took the opportunity to put in hurriedly, conciliatingly. "I just happened to be coming by, hungry tonight, a lonely tramp, and knocked at the window. Your wife was a bit foolish, and let kind-heartedness get the better of prudence." "Don't think you've pulled the wool over my eyes, Effie," Hank went on with a screechy laugh, disregarding the other man completely. Don't think I don't know why you're suddenly going to have a child after 4 long years. At that moment the cat came nosing up to his feet. Patrick watched him narrowly, shifting his weight forward a little, but Hank only kicked the animal aside without taking his eyes off them. Even that business of carrying the wrist watch in your pocket instead of on your arm, he went on with channeled hysteria. A neat bit of camouflage, Effie, very neat. And telling me it was my child, when all the while you've been seeing him for months. Man, you're mad. I've not touched her, Patrick denied hotly, though still calculatingly, and risked a step forward, stopping when the gun instantly swung his way. Pretending you were going to give me a healthy child, Hank raved on, when all the while you knew it would be either in body or germ plasma, a thing like that. He waved his gun at the malformed cat, which had leaped to the top of the table and was eating the remains of Patrick's food, though its watchful green eyes were fixed on Hank. I should shoot him down, Hank yelled between sobbing, chest-racking inhalations through the mask. I should kill him this instant for the contaminated pariah he is. All this while, Effie had not ceased to smile compassionately. Now she stood up without haste and went to Patrick's side. Disregarding his warning, apprehensive glance, she put her arm lightly around him and faced her husband. Then you'd be killing the bringer of the best news we've ever had, she said, and her voice was like a flood of some warm, sweet liquor in that musty, hate-charged room. Oh, Hank, forget your silly, wrong jealousy and listen to me. Patrick here has something wonderful to tell us. Hank stared at her. For once he screamed no reply. It was obvious that he was seeing for the first time how beautiful she had become, and that the realization jolted him terribly. What do you mean? He finally asked unevenly, almost fearfully. I mean that we no longer need to fear the dust, she said, and now her smile was radiant. It never really did hurt people the way the doctor said it would. Remember how it was with me, Hank? The exposure I had and recovered from, although the doctor said I wouldn't at first, and without even losing my hair? Hank, those who are brave enough to stay outside, and who weren't killed by terror and suggestion and panic, they adapted to the dust. They changed, but they changed for the better. Everything... Effie, he told you lies, Hank interrupted, but still in that same agitated, broken voice, cowed by her beauty. Everything that grew or moved was purified, she went on ringingly. You men going outside have never seen it, because you've never had eyes for it. You've been blinded to beauty, to life itself. And now all the power in the dust has gone and faded anyway, burned itself out. That's true, isn't it? She smiled at Patrick for confirmation. His face was strangely veiled, as if he were calculating obscure changes. He might have given a little nod. At any rate, Effie assumed that he did, for she turned back to her husband. You see, Hank, we can all go out now. We need never fear the dust again. Patrick is a living proof of that, she continued triumphantly, standing straighter, holding him a little tighter. Look at him! Not a scar or a sign, and he's been out in the dust for years. How could he be this way if the dust hurt the brave? Oh, believe me, Hank. Believe what you see. Test it if you want. Test Patrick here. Effie, you're all mixed up. You don't know, Hank faltered, but without conviction of any sort. Just test him, Effie repeated with utter confidence, ignoring, not even noticing, Patrick's warning nudge. All right, Hank mumbled. He looked at the stranger dully. "Can you count?" he asked. Patrick's face was a complete enigma. Then he suddenly spoke, and his voice was like a fencer's foil, light, bright, alert, constantly playing, yet utterly on guard. "Can I count? Do you take me for a complete simpleton, man? Of course I can count." "Then count yourself," Hank said, barely indicating the table. "Count myself, should I?" the other retorted with a quick, facetious laugh. "Is this a kindergarten? But if you want me to, I'm willing." His voice was rapid. "I've 2 arms, 2 legs, that's 4, and 10 fingers and 10 toes. You'll take my word for them. That's 24, a head, 25, and 2 eyes, and a nose, and a mouth." "With this, I mean," Hank said heavily, advanced to the table, picked up the Geiger counter, switched it on, and handed it across the table to the other man. But while it was still an arm's length from Patrick, the clicks began to mount furiously until they were like the chatter of a pygmy machine gun. Abruptly the clicks slowed, but that was only the counter shifting to a new scaling circuit, in which every click stood for 512 of the old ones. With those horrid, rattling little volleys, fear cascaded into the room and filled it, smashing like so much colored glass all the bright barriers of words Effie had raised against it. For no dreams can stand against the Geiger counter, the 20th century's mouthpiece of ultimate truth. It was as if the dust and all the terrors of the dust had incarnated themselves in one dread invading shape that said in words stronger than audible speech, "Those were illusions, whistles in the dark. This is reality. The dreary, pitiless reality of the burrowing years." Hank scuttled back to the wall. Through chattering teeth, he babbled, "Enough radioactives. Kill 1,000 men. Freak, a freak." In his agitation, he forgot for a moment to inhale through the respirator. Even Effie, taken off guard, all the fears that had been drilled into her twanging like piano wires, shrank from the skeletal-seeming shape beside her, held herself to it only by desperation. Patrick did it for her. He disengaged her arm and stepped briskly away. Then he whirled on them, smiling sardonically, and started to speak, but instead looked with distaste at the chattering Geiger counter he held between fingers and thumb. "Have we listened to this racket long enough?" he asked. Without waiting for an answer, he put down the instrument on the table. The cat hurried over to it curiously, and the clicks began again to mount to a minor crescendo. Effie lunged for it frantically. She switched it off, darted back. "That's right," Patrick said with another chilling smile. "You do well to cringe, for I'm death itself. Even in death I could kill you like a snake." And with that his voice took on the tones of a circus barker. "Yes, I'm a freak, as the gentleman so wisely said. That's what one doctor who dared talk with me for a minute told me before he kicked me out. He couldn't tell me why, but somehow the dust doesn't kill me. Besides, I'm a freak, you see, just like the men who ate nails and walked on fire and ate arsenic and sucked themselves through with pins. Step right up, ladies and gentlemen, only not too close, and examine the man that dust can't harm. Rappaccini's child, brought up to date. His embrace, death." "And now," he said, breathing heavily, "I'll get out and leave you in your damned lead cave." He started toward the window. Hank's gun followed him shakingly. "Wait!" Effie called in an agonized voice. He obeyed. She continued falteringly, "When we were together earlier, you didn't act as if—" When we were together earlier, I wanted what I wanted, he snarled at her. You don't suppose I'm a bloody saint, do you? And all the beautiful things you told me? That, he said cruelly, is just the line I've found that women fall for. They're all so bored and so starved for beauty, as they generally put it. Even the garden? Her question was barely audible through the sobs that threatened to suffocate her. He looked at her, and perhaps his expression softened a trifle. What's outside, he said flatly, is just a little worse than either of you can imagine. He tapped his temple. The garden's all here. You've killed it, she wept. You've killed it in me. You've both killed everything that's beautiful, but you're worse, she screamed at Patrick. Because he only killed beauty once, but you brought it to life just so you could kill it again. Oh, I can't stand it. I won't stand it. And she began to scream. Patrick started toward her, but she broke off and whirled away from him to the window, her eyes crazy. You've been lying to us, she cried. The garden's there. I know it is. But you don't want to share it with anyone. No, no, Euphemia, Patrick protested anxiously. It's hell out there, believe me. I wouldn't lie to you about it. Wouldn't lie to me? She mocked. Are you afraid too? With a sudden pull, she jerked open the window and stood before the blank green-tinged oblong of darkness that seemed to press into the room like a menacing, heavy, wind-urged curtain. At that, Hank cried out a shocked, pleading, Effie! She ignored him. I can't be cooped up here any longer, she said. And I won't, now that I know. I'm going to the garden. Both men sprang at her, but they were too late. She leaped lightly to the sill, and by the time they had flung themselves against it, her footsteps were already hurrying off into the darkness. Effie, come back, come back! Hank shouted after her desperately, no longer thinking to cringe from the man beside him, or how the gun was pointed. I love you, Effie. Come back. Patrick added his voice. Come back, Euphemia. You'll be safe if you come back right away. Come back to your home. No answer to that at all. They both strained their eyes through the greenish murk. They could barely make out a shadowy figure about half a block down the near black canyon of the dismal, dust-blown street into which the greenish moonlight hardly reached. It seemed to them that the figure was scooping something up from the pavement and letting it sift down along its arms and over its bosom. Go out and get her, man, Patrick urged the other. For if I go out for her, I warn you I won't bring her back. She said something about having stood the dust better than most, and that's enough for me. But Hank, chained by his painfully learned habits and by something else, could not move. And then a ghostly voice came whispering down the street, chanting, Fire can hurt me, or water, or the weight of the earth, but the dust is my friend. Patrick spared the other man one more look. Then, without a word, he vaulted up and ran off. Hank stood there. After perhaps half a minute, he remembered to close his mouth when he inhaled. Finally, he was sure the street was empty. As he started to close the window, there was a little meow. He picked up the cat and gently put it outside. Then he did close the window and the shutters and bolted them, and took up the Geiger counter, and mechanically began to count himself. End of The Moon is Green by Fritz Leiber. This recording by Phil Chenevert. read by Fritz Leiber. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. As a blisteringly hot but guaranteed weather-controlled future summer day dawned on the Mississippi Valley, the walking mills of Puffy Products, spiked to loaf in one operation, began to tread delicately on their centipede legs across the wheat fields of Kansas. The walking mills resembled fat metal serpents rather larger than those Chinese paper dragons animated by files of men in procession. Sensory robot devices in their noses informed them that the waiting wheat had reached ripe perfection. As they advanced, their heads swung lazily from side to side, very much like snakes, gobbling the yellow grain. In their throats it was threshed, the chaff bundled and burped aside for pickup by the crawl trucks of a chemical corporation, the kernels quick-dried and blown along into the mighty chests of the machines. There the tireless mills ground the kernels to flour, which was instantly sifted, the bran being packaged and dropped like the chaff for pickup. A cluster of tanks, which gave the metal serpents a decidedly humpbacked appearance, added water, shortening, salt, and other ingredients, some named and some not. The dough was at the same time infused with gas from a tank conspicuously labeled carbon dioxide. No yeast creatures in your bread. Thus instantly risen, the dough was clipped into loaves and shot into radionic ovens, forming the midsections of the metal serpents. There the bread was baked in a matter of seconds, a fierce heat front browning the crusts, and the piping hot loaves sealed in transparent plastic bearing the proud Puffy loaf emblem, 2 cherubs circling a floating loaf, and injected into the delivery platform at each serpent's rear end, where a cluster of pickup machines, like hungry piglets, snatched at the loaves with hygienic claws. A few loaves would be hurried off for the day's consumption, the majority stored for winter in strategically located mammoth deep freezes. But now, behold a wonder! As the loaves began to appear on the delivery platform of the first walking mill to get into action, they did not linger on the conveyor belt, but rose gently into the air and slowly traveled off downwind across the hot, rippling fields. The robot claws of the pickup machines clutched in vain, and, not noticing the difference, proceeded carefully to stack emptiness, tier by tier. One errant loaf, rising more sluggishly than its fellows, was snagged by a thrusting claw. The machine paused, clumsily wiped off the injured loaf, set it aside, where it bobbed on one corner, unable to take off again, and went back to the work of storing nothingness. A flock of crows rose from the trees of a nearby shelter belt as the flight of loaves approached. The crows swooped to investigate, and then suddenly scattered, screeching in panic. The helicopter of a hangover-ish Sunday traveler bound for Wichita shied very similarly from the brown flyers and did not return for a second look. A black-haired housewife spied them over her back fence, crossed herself, and grabbed her walkie-talkie from the laundry basket. Seconds later, the yawning correspondent of a regional newspaper was jotting down the lead of a humorous news story which, recalling the old flying saucer scares, stated that now apparently bread was to be included in the mad aerial tea party. The congregation of an open-walled country church, standing up to recite the most familiar of Christian prayers, had just reached the petition for daily sustenance when a sub-flight of the loaves, either forced down by a vagrant wind or lacking the natural buoyancy of the rest, came coasting silently as the sunbeams between the graceful pillars at the altar end of the building. Meanwhile, the main flight, now augmented by other bread flocks from scores and hundreds of walking mills that had started to work a little later, mounted slowly and majestically into the cirrus-flecked upper air, where a steady wind was blowing strongly toward the east. About 1,000 miles farther on in that direction, where a cluster of stratosphere-tickling towers marked the location of the metropolis of New York, a tender scene was being enacted in the pressurized penthouse managerial suite of Puffy Products. Megara Winterly, secretary-in-chief to the managerial board and referred to by her underlings as the Blonde Icicle, was dealing with the advances of Roger Racehorse Snedden, assistant secretary to the board, and often indistinguishable from any passing office boy. "Why don't you jump out the window, Roger, remembering to shut the airlock after you?" the Golden Glacier said in tones not unkind. "When are your high-strung, thoroughbred nerves going to accept the fact that I would never consider marriage with a business inferior? You have about as much chance as a starving Ukrainian kulak now that Moscow's clapped on the interdict." Roger's voice was calm, although his eyes were feverishly bright as he replied, "A lot of things are going to be different around here, Meg, as soon as the board is forced to admit that only my quick thinking made it possible to bring the name of Puffyloaf in front of the whole world." "Puffyloaf could do with a little of that," the business girl observed judiciously. "The way sales have been plummeting, it won't be long before the government deeds our desks to the managers of Fairy Bread and asks us to take the big jump. But just where does your quick thinking come into this, Mr. Snedden? You can't be referring to the helium. That was Rose Thinker's brainwave." She studied him suspiciously. "You've birthed another promotional bumble, Roger. I can see it in your eyes. I only hope it's not as big a one as when you put the Martian ambassador on 3D and he thanked you profusely for the gross of Puffyloaves, assuring you that he'd never slept on a softer mattress in all his life on 2 planets. Listen to me, Meg. Today, yes, today, you're going to see the board eating out of my hand. Ah, I guarantee you won't have any fingers left. You're bold enough now, but when Mr. Gryce and those 2 big machines come through that door... Now, wait a minute, Meg. Hush, they're coming now." Roger leaped 3 feet in the air, but managed to land without a sound and edged toward his stool. Through the dilating iris of the door strode Phineas T. Gryce, flanked by Rose Thinker and Tin Philosopher. The man approached the conference table in the center of the room with measured pace and gravely expressionless face. The rose-tinted machine on his left did a couple of impulsive pirouettes on the way and twittered a greeting to Meg and Roger. The other machine quietly took the third of the high seats and lifted a claw at Meg, who now occupied a stool twice the height of Roger's. "Miss Winterly, please, our theme." The Blonde Icicle's face thawed into a little girl's smile, and she chanted bubblingly, "Made up of tiny wheaten motes and reinforced with sturdy oats, rises through the air and floats, the bread on which all Terra dotes." "Thank you, Miss Winterly," said Tin Philosopher. "Though a purely figurative statement, that bit about rising through the air always gets me. Here." He rapped his midsection, which gave off a high musical clang. "Ladies," he inclined his photocells toward Rose Thinker and Meg, "and gentlemen, this is a historic occasion in Old Puppy's long history. The inauguration of the helium-filled loaf, so light it almost floats away, in which that inert and heavenly aspiring gas replaces old-fashioned carbon dioxide. Later there will be kudos for Rose Thinker, whose bright relays genius sparked the idea, and also for Roger Snedden, who took care of the details. By the by, Racehorse, That was a brilliant piece of work getting the helium out of the government. They've been pretty stuffy lately about their monopoly. But first, I want to throw wide the casement in your minds that opens on the long view of things." Rose Thinker spun twice on her chair and opened her photocells wide. Tin Philosopher coughed to limber up the diaphragm of his speaker and continued. "Ever since the first cave wife boasted to her next den neighbor about the superior paleness and fluffiness of her tortillas, mankind has sought lighter, whiter bread. Indeed, thinkers wiser than myself have equated the whole upward course of culture with this poignant quest. Yeast was a wonderful discovery for its primitive day. Sifting the bran and wheat germ from the flour was an even more important advance. Early bleaching and preserving chemicals played their humble parts. For a while, barbarous faddists, blind to the deeply spiritual nature of bread, which is recognized by all great religions, held back our march toward perfection with their hair-splitting insistence on vitamin content of the wheat germ. But their case collapsed when tasteless, colorless substitutes were triumphantly synthesized and introduced into the loaf, which, for flawless purity, unequaled airiness, and sheer intangible goodness, was rapidly becoming mankind's supreme gustatory experience. "I wonder what this stuff tastes like," Rose Thinker said out of a clear sky. "I wonder what taste tastes like," Tin Philosopher echoed dreamily. Recovering himself, he continued, "Then, early in the 21st century, came the epochal researches of Everett Whitehead, puffy loaf chemist, culminating in his paper, The Structural Bubble in Cereal Masses, and making possible the baking of air-tight bread 20 times stronger for its weight than steel, and of a lightness that would have been incredible even to the advanced chemist bakers of the 20th century, a lightness so great that besides forming the backbone of our own promotion, it has forever since been capitalized on by our conscienceless competitors of fairy bread with their enduring slogan, 'It makes ghost toast.'" "That's a beaut, all right, that ecto-do blurb," Rose Thinker admitted, bugging her photocell sadly. "Wait a sec. How about, 'There'll be bread overhead when you're dead, it is said.'" Phineas T. Gryce wrinkled his nostrils at the pink machine as if he smelled her insulation smoldering. He said mildly, "A somewhat unhappy jingle, Rose, referring as it does to the end of the customer as consumer. Moreover, we shouldn't overplay the figurative rises through the air angle. What inspired you?" She shrugged. "I don't know. Oh, yes, I do. I was remembering one of the workers' songs we machines used to chant during the big strike. 'Work and pray. Live on hay. You'll get pie in the sky. When you die, it's a lie.' I don't know why we chanted it," she added. "We didn't want pie, or hay for that matter, and machines don't pray except Tibetan prayer wheels." Phineas T. Gryce shook his head. "Labor relations are another topic we should stay far away from. However, dear Rose, I'm glad you keep trying to outjingle those dirty crooks at Fairy Bread." He scowled, turning back his attention to Tin Philosopher. "I get whopping mad, old machine, whenever I hear that other slogan of theirs, the discriminatory one, 'Untouched by robot claws,' just because they employ a few filthy androids in their factories." Tin Philosopher lifted one of his own sets of bright talons. Thanks, P.T. But to continue my historical resume, the next great advance in the baking art was the substitution of purified carbon dioxide removed from coal smoke for the gas generated by yeast organisms indwelling in the dough and later killed by the heat of baking, their corpses remaining in situ. But even purified carbon dioxide is itself a rather repugnant gas, a product of metabolism, whether fast or slow, and forever associated with those life processes which are obnoxious to the fastidious. Here the machine shuddered with delicate clinkings. Therefore, we of Puffyloaf are taking today what may be the ultimate step toward purity. We are aerating our loaves with the noble gas helium, an element which remains virginal in the face of all chemical temptations, and whose slim molecules are 11 times lighter than obese carbon dioxide. Yes, noble, uncontaminable helium, which, if it be a kind of ash, is yet the ash only of radioactive burning, accomplished or initiated directly on the sun, a safe 93 million miles from this planet. Let's have a cheer for the helium loaf. Without changing expression, Phineas T. Gryce rapped the table thrice in solemn applause, while the others bowed their heads. "Thanks, T.P.," P.T. then said. "And now for the moment of truth. Miss Winterly, how is the helium loaf selling?" The business girl clapped on a pair of earphones and whispered into a lapel mic. Her gaze grew abstracted as she mentally translated flurries of brief squawks into coherent messages. Suddenly a single vertical furrow creased her matchlessly smooth brow. "It isn't, Mr. Gryce," she gasped in horror. "Fairy Bread is outselling Puffyloaves by an infinity factor. So far this morning, there has not been one single delivery of Puffyloaves to any sales spot. Complaints about non-delivery are pouring in from both walking stores and sessile shops." "Mr. Snedden," Gryce barked, "what bugs in the new helium process might account for this delay?" Roger was on his feet, looking bewildered. "I can't imagine, sir, unless, just possibly, there's been some unforeseeable difficulty involving the new metal foil wrappers." "Metal foil wrappers? Were you responsible for those?" "Yes, sir. Last-minute recalculations showed that the extra lightness of the new loaf might be great enough to cause drift during stackage. Drafts in stores might topple sales pyramids. Metal foil wrappers, by their added weight, took care of the difficulty." "And you ordered them without consulting the board?" "Yes, sir. There was hardly time, and—" "Why, you fool! I noticed that order for metal foil wrappers, assumed it was some sub-secretary's mistake, and canceled it last night." Roger Snedden turned pale. "You canceled it?" he quavered. "And told them to go back to the lighter plastic wrappers?" "Of course. Just what is behind all this, Mr. Snedden? What recalculations were you trusting when our physicist had demonstrated months ago that the helium loaf was safely stackable in light airs and gentle breezes, winds up to Beaufort Scale 3? Why should a change from heavier to lighter wrappers result in complete non-delivery?" Roger Snedden's paleness became tinged with an interesting green. He cleared his throat and made strange gulping noises. 10 philosophers' photocells focused on him calmly, rose thinkers with unfeigned excitement. P.T. Gryce's frown grew blacker by the moment, while McGurter Winterly's Venus mask showed an odd dawning of dismay and awe. She was getting new squawks in her earphones. Roger said in winning tones. Well, you see, the fact is that I... Hold it, Meg interrupted crisply. Triple urgent from Public Relations Safety Division. Tulsa Topeka Aero Express makes emergency landing after being buffeted in encounter with vast flight of objects first described as brown birds, although no failures reported in Airways electronic anti-bird fences. After grounding safely near Emporia, no fatalities. Pilot's windshield found thinly plastered with soft white and brown material. Emblems on plastic wrappers embedded in material identify it incontrovertibly as an undetermined number of puffy loaves cruising at 3,000 feet. Eyes and photocells turned inquisitorially upon Roger Snetting. He went from green to puffy loaf white and blurted, "All right, I did it, but it was the only way out. Yesterday morning, due to the Ukrainian crisis, the government stopped sales and deliveries of all strategic stockpile materials, including helium gas. Puffy's new program of advertising and promotion, based on the lighter loaf, was already rolling. There was only one thing to do. There being only one other gas comparable in lightness to helium, I diverted the necessary quantity of hydrogen gas from the hydrogenated oil section of our Magna Margarine division and substituted it for the helium." "You substituted hydrogen for the helium?" Phineas T. Gryce faltered in low mechanical tones, taking 4 steps backward. "Hydrogen is twice as light as helium," Tin Philosopher remarked judiciously. "And many times cheaper. Did you know that?" Roger countered feebly. "Yes, I substituted hydrogen. The metal foil wrapping would have added just enough weight to counteract the greater buoyancy of the hydrogen loaf, but—" "So when this morning's loaves began to arrive on the delivery platforms of the walking mills," Tin Philosopher left the remark unfinished. "Exactly," Roger agreed dismally. "Let me ask you, Mr. Snedden," Gryce interjected, still in low tones, "if you expected people to jump to the kitchen ceiling for their puffy loaf after taking off the metal wrapper, or reach for the sky if they happened to unwrap the stuff outdoors?" "Mr. Gryce," Roger said reproachfully, "you have often assured me that what people do with puffy loaf after they buy it is no concern of ours." "I seem to recall," Rose Thinker chirped somewhat unkindly, "that dictum was created to answer inquiries after Roger put the famous sculptures in miniature artist on 3D, and he testified that he always molded his first attempts from puffy bread, one jumbo loaf squeezing down to approximately the size of a peanut." Her photocells dimmed and brightened. "Oh boy, hydrogen! The loaves unwrapped. After a while, in spite of the crust seal, a little oxygen diffuses in. An explosive mixture. Housewife in curlers and kimono pops a couple slices in the toaster. Boom!" The 3 human beings in the room winced. Tin Philosopher kicked her under the table while observing, "So you see, Roger, that the non-delivery of the hydrogen loaf carries some consolations, and I must confess that one aspect of the affair gives me great satisfaction, not as a board member, but as a private machine. You have at last made a reality of the rises through the air part of Puffy Bread's theme. They can't ever take that away from you. By now, half the inhabitants of the Great Plains must have observed our flying loaves rising high." Phineas T. Gryce shot a frightened look at the west windows and found his full voice. "Stop the mills!" he roared at Meg Winterly, who nodded and whispered urgently into her mic. "A sensible suggestion," Tin Philosopher said, "but it comes a trifle late in the day. If the mills are still walking and grinding, approximately 7 billion puffy loaves are at this moment cruising eastward over Middle America. Remember that a 6-month supply for deep freeze is involved, and that the current consumption of bread, due to its matchless airiness, is 8½ loaves per person per day. Phineas T. Gryce carefully inserted both hands into his scanty hair, feeling for a good grip. He leaned menacingly toward Roger, who, chin resting on the table, regarded him apathetically. "Hold it!" Meg called sharply. "Flock of multiple urgents coming in. News liaison. Information bureaus swamped with flying bread inquiries. Aero express lines. Clear our airways or face lawsuit. U.S. Army. Why do loaves flame when hit by incendiary bullets? U.S. Customs. If bread intended for export, get export license or face prosecution. Russian consulate in Chicago. Advise on destination of bread lift. And some Kansas church is accusing us of a hoax inciting to blasphemy or faking miracles. I don't know why." The business girl tore off her headphones. "Roger Snedden," she cried with a hysteria that would have dumbfounded her underlings, "you brought the name of Puffyloaf in front of the whole world, all right. Now do something about the situation." Roger nodded obediently, but his pallor increased a shade, the pupils of his eyes disappeared under upper lids, and his head burrowed beneath his forearms. "Oh, boy," Rose Thinker called gaily to Tin Philosopher. "This looks like the start of a real crisis session. Did you remember to bring spare batteries?" Meanwhile, the monstrous flight of puffy loaves, filling Midwestern skies as no small flyer had since the days of the passenger pigeon, soared steadily onward. Private flyers approached the brown and glistening bread front in curiosity and dipped back in awe. Aero express lines organized sightseeing flights along the flanks. Planes of the government forestry and agricultural services and copters bearing the Puffyloaf emblem hovered on the fringes, watching developments and waiting for orders. A squadron of supersonic fighters hung menacingly above. The behavior of birds varied considerably. Most fled or gave the loaves a wide berth, but some bolder species, discovering the minimal nutritive nature of the translucent brown objects, attacked them furiously with beaks and claws. Hydrogen, diffusing slowly through the crusts, had now distended most of the sealed plastic wrappers into little balloons, which ruptured when pierced, with disconcerting pops. Below, neck-craning citizens crowded streets and backyards. Cranks and cultists had a field day, while local and national governments raged indiscriminately at Puffyloaf and at each other. Rumors that a fusion weapon would be exploded in the midst of the flying bread drew angry protests from conservationists and a flood of telefax pamphlets titled H-Loaf or H-Bomb. Stockholm sent a mystifying note of praise to the United Nations Food Organization. Delhi issued numerous denials of a millet blight that no one had heard of until that moment, and reaffirmed India's ability to feed her population with no outside help except the usual. Radio Moscow asserted that the Kremlin would brook no interference in its treatment of the Ukrainians, jokingly referred to the flying bread as a farce perpetrated by mad internationalists inhabiting Cloud Cuckoo Land, added contradictory references to airborne bread booby-trapped by capitalist gangsters, and then fell moodily silent on the whole topic. Radio Venus reported to its winged audience that Earth's inhabitants were establishing food depots in the upper air, preparatory to taking up permanent aerial residence, such as we have always enjoyed on Venus. New York made feverish preparations for the passage of the flying bread. Tickets for sightseeing space and skyscrapers were sold at high prices. Cold meats and potted spreads were hawked to viewers with the assurance that they would be able to snag the bread out of the air and enjoy a historic sandwich. Phineas T. Gryce, escaping from his own managerial suite, ranged about the city, demanding general cooperation in the stretching of great nets between the skyscrapers to trap the errant loaves. He was captured by Tin Philosopher, escaped again, and was found posted with oxygen mask and submachine gun on the topmost spire of Puffyloaf Tower, apparently determined to shoot down the loaves as they appeared and before they involved his company in more trouble with customs and the State Department. Recaptured by Tin Philosopher, who suffered only minor bullet holes, he was given a series of mild electroshocks and returned to the conference table calm and clear-headed as ever. But the bread flight, swinging away from a hurricane moving up the Atlantic coast, crossed a clouded-in Boston by night and disappeared into a high Atlantic overcast, also thereby evading a local storm generated by the Weather Department in a last-minute effort to bring down or at least disperse the H-loaves. Warnings and counter-warnings by communist and capitalist governments seriously interfered with military trailing of the flight during this period, and it was actually lost in touch with for several days. At scattered points, seagulls were observed fighting over individual loaves floating down from the gray roof, that was all. A mood of spirituality strongly tinged with humor seized the people of the world. Ministers sermonized about the bread, variously interpreting it as a call to charity, a warning against gluttony, a parable of the evanescence of all earthly things, and a divine joke. Husbands and wives, facing each other across their walls of breakfast toast, burst into laughter. The mere sight of a loaf of bread anywhere was enough to evoke guffaws. An obscure sect, having as part of its creed the injunction, "Don't take yourself so damn seriously," won new adherents. The bread flight, rising above an Atlantic storm widely reported to have destroyed it, passed unobserved across a foggy England and rose out of the overcast only over Mittel Europa. The loaves had at last reached their maximum altitude. The sun's rays beat through the rarefied air on the distended plastic wrappers, increasing still further the pressure of the confined hydrogen. They burst by the millions and tens of millions. A high-flying Bulgarian evangelist, who had happened to mistake the up lever for the east lever in the cockpit of his flyer, and who was the sole witness of the event, afterward described it as the foaming of a sea of diamonds, the crackle of God's knuckles. By the millions and tens of millions, the loaves coasted down into the starving Ukraine. Shaken by a week of humor that threatened to invade even its own grim precincts, the Kremlin made a sudden about-face. A new policy was instituted of communal ownership of the produce of communal farms. The teams of hunger fighters and caravans of trucks loaded with pumpernickel were dispatched into the Ukraine. World distribution was given to a series of photographs showing peasants queuing up to trade scavenged puffy loaves for traditional black bread, recently aerated itself but still extra solid by comparison, the rate of exchange demanded by Moscow teams being 20 puffy loaves to 1 of pumpernickel. Another series of photographs picturing chubby workers' children being blown to bits by booby-trapped bread was quietly destroyed. Congratulatory notes were exchanged by various national governments and world organizations, including the Brotherhood of Free Business Machines. The great bread flight was over, though for several weeks afterward scattered falls of loaves occurred, giving rise to a new folklore of manna among lonely Arabian tribesmen, and in one well-authenticated instance in Tibet, sustaining life in a party of mountaineers cut off by a snowslide. Back in New York, the managerial board of Puffy Products slumped in utter collapse around the conference table. The long crisis session at last ended. Empty coffee cartons were scattered around the chairs of the three humans, dead batteries around those of the two machines. For a while, there was no movement whatsoever. Then Roger Snedden reached out wearily for the earphones where Megara Winterly had hurled them down, adjusted them to his head, pushed a button, and listened apathetically. After a bit, his gaze brightened. He pushed more buttons and listened more eagerly. Soon he was sitting tensely upright on his stool, eyes bright and lower face all a smile, muttering tense comments and questions into the lapel mic torn from Meg's fair neck. The others, reviving, watched him, at first dully, then with quickening interest, especially when he jerked off the earphones with a happy shout and sprang to his feet. "Listen to this!" he cried in a ringing voice. "As a result of the worldwide publicity, Puffy Loaves are outselling Fairy Bread 3-1, and that's just the old carbon dioxide stock from our freezers. It's almost exhausted, but the government, now that the Ukrainian crisis is over, has taken the ban off helium and will also sell us stockpiled wheat if we need it. We can have our walking mills burrowing into the wheat caves in a matter of hours. But that isn't all. The far greater demand everywhere is for Puffy Loaves that will actually float. Public Relations Child Liaison Division reports that the kiddies are making their mothers' lives miserable about it. If only we can figure out some way to make hydrogen non-explosive or the helium loaf float just a little, I'm sure we can take care of that quite handily," Tin Philosopher interrupted briskly. "Puffy Loaf has kept it a corporation secret. Even you've never been told about it. But just before he went crazy, Everett Whitehead discovered a way to make bread using only half as much flour as we do in the present loaf. Using this secret technique, which we've been saving for just such an emergency, it will be possible to bake a helium loaf as buoyant in every respect as the hydrogen loaf." "Good!" Roger cried. "We'll tether 'em on strings and sell 'em like balloons. No mother-child shopping team will leave the store without a cluster. Buying bread balloons will be the big event of the day for kiddies. It'll make the carry-home shopping load lighter, too. I'll issue orders at once." He broke off, looking at Phineas T. Gryce, said with quiet assurance, "Excuse me, sir, if I seem to be taking too much upon myself." "Not at all, son. Go straight ahead," the great manager said approvingly. "You're—" he laughed in anticipation of getting off a memorable remark, "rising to the challenging situation like a genuine puffy loaf." Megara Winterly looked from the older man to the younger. Then, in a single leap, she was upon Roger, her arms wrapped tightly around him. "My sweet little ever-victorious self-propelled monkey wrench," she crooned in his ear. Roger looked fatuously over her soft shoulder at Tin Philosopher, who, as if moved by some similar feeling, reached over and touched claws with Rose Thinker. This, however, was what he telegraphed silently to his fellow machine across the circuit so completed. "Good-o, Rosie. That makes another victory for robot-engineered world unity, though you almost gave us away at the start with that bread overhead jingle. We've struck another blow against the next world war, in which, as we know only too well, we machines would suffer the most. Now, if we can only arrange, say, a fur famine in Alaska, and a migration of long-haired Siberian lemmings across Bering Straits, we'd have to swing the Japanese current up there so it'd be warm enough for the little fellows. Anyhow, Rosie, with a spot of help from the Brotherhood, those humans will paint themselves into the peace corner yet." Meanwhile, he and Rose Thinker quietly watched the blonde icicle melt. End of Bread Overhead by Fritz Leiber. This story recorded by Phil Chenevert. What's he doing in there? By Fritz Leiber. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The professor was congratulating Earth's first visitor from another planet on his wisdom in getting in touch with a cultural anthropologist before contacting any other scientists or governments, God forbid, and in learning English from radio and TV before landing from his orbit-parked rocket, when the Martian stood up and said hesitantly, "Excuse me, please, but where is it?" That baffled the professor, and the Martian seemed to grow anxious. At least his long mouth curved upward, and he had earlier explained that curling downward was his smile, and he repeated, "Please, where is it?" He was surprisingly humanoid in most respects, but his complexion was textured, so like the rich dark armchair he'd just been occupying, that the professor's pin-striped gray suit, which he had eagerly consented to wear, seemed an arbitrary interruption between him and the chair, a sort of Mother Hubbard dress on a phantom conjured from its leather. The professor's wife, always a perceptive hostess, came to her husband's rescue by saying with equal rapidity, "Top of the stairs, into the hall, last door." The Martian's mouth curled happily downward, and he said, "Thank you very much," and was off. Comprehension burst on the professor. He caught up with his guest at the foot of the stairs. "Here, I'll show you the way," he said. "No, I can find it myself, thank you," the Martian assured him. Something rather final in the Martian's tone made the professor desist, and after watching his visitor sway up the stairs with an almost hypnotic, softly jogging movement, he rejoined his wife in the study, saying wonderingly, "Who'd have thought it, by George? Function taboos as strict as our own." "I'm glad some of your professional visitors maintain 'em," his wife said darkly. "But this one's from Mars, darling, and to find out he's, well, similar in an aspect of his life is as thrilling as the discovery that water is burned hydrogen. When I think of the day, not far distant, when I'll put his entries in the cross-cultural index—" He was still rhapsodizing when the professor's little son raced in. "Pop, the Martian's gone to the bathroom." "Hush, dear, manners." Now it's perfectly natural, darling, that the boy should notice and be excited. "Yes, son, the Martian's not very different from us." "Oh, certainly," the professor's wife said with a trace of bitterness. "I don't imagine his turquoise complexion will cause any comment at all when you bring him to a faculty reception. They'll just figure he had a hard night, and that he got that baby elephant nose sniffing around for assistant professorships. Really, darling, he probably thinks of our noses as disagreeably amputated and paralyzed." "Well, anyway, Pop, he's in the bathroom. I followed him when he squiggled upstairs." "Now, son, you shouldn't have done that. He's on a strange planet, and it might make him nervous if he thought he was being spied on. We must show him every courtesy. By George, I can't wait to discuss these things with Ackerly Ramsbottom. When I think of how much more this encounter has to give the anthropologist than even the physicist or astronomer—" He was still going strong on his second rhapsody when he was interrupted by another high-speed entrance. It was the professor's coltish daughter. "Mom, Pop, the Martians—" "Hush, dear, we know." The professor's coltish daughter regained her adolescent poise, which was considerable. "Well, he's still in there," she said. "I just tried the door, and it was locked." "I'm glad it was," the professor said, while his wife added, "Yes, you can't be sure what—" and she caught herself. "Really, dear, that was very bad manners." "I thought he'd come downstairs long ago," her daughter explained. "He's been in there an awful long time. It must have been a half an hour ago that I saw him gyre and gimble upstairs in that real gone way he has, with Nosy here following him." The professor's coltish daughter was currently soaking up both Jive and Alice. When the professor checked his wristwatch, his expression grew troubled. "By George, he is taking his time, though of course we don't know how much time Martians. I wonder." "I've listened for a while, Pop," his son volunteered. "He was running the water a lot." "Running the water, eh? We know Mars is a water-starved planet. I suppose that in the presence of unlimited water he might be seized by a kind of madness and... But he seems so well adjusted." Then his wife spoke, voicing all their thoughts. Her outlook on life gave her a naturally sepulchral voice. "What's he doing in there?" 20 minutes and at least as many fantastic suggestions later, the professor glanced again at his watch and nerved himself for action. Motioning his family aside, he mounted the stairs and tiptoed down the hall. He paused only once to shake his head and mutter under his breath, "By George, I wish I had Fenchurch or Von Gottschalk here. They're a shade better than I am on intercultural contacts, especially taboo breaking and affronts." His family followed him at a short distance. The professor stopped in front of the bathroom door. Everything was quiet as death. He listened for a minute, and then rapped measuredly, steadying his hand by clutching its wrist with the other. There was a faint splashing, but no other sound. Another minute passed. The professor rapped again. Now there was no response at all. He very gingerly tried the knob. The door was still locked. When he had retreated to the stairs, it was the professor's wife who once more voiced their thoughts. This time her voice carried overtones of supernatural horror. "What's he doing in there?" "He may be dead or dying," the professor's coltish daughter suggested briskly. "Maybe we ought to call the fire department like they did for old Mrs. Frisbee." The professor winced. "I'm afraid you haven't visualized the complications, dear," he said gently. "No one but ourselves knows that the Martian is on Earth, or has even the slightest inkling that interplanetary travel has been achieved. Whatever we do, it will have to be on our own. But to break in on a creature engaged in, well, we don't know what primal private activity, is against all anthropological practice. Still—" "Dying's a primal activity," his daughter said crisply. "So's ritual bathing before mass murder," his wife added. "Please. Still, as I was about to say, we do have the moral duty to succor him, as you all too reasonably suggest. He has been incapacitated by a germ or virus, or more likely by some simple environmental factor such as Earth's greater gravity. Tell you what, Pop, I can look in the bathroom window and see what he's doing. All I have to do is crawl out my bedroom window and along the gutter a little ways. It's safe as houses." The professor's question, beginning with, "Son, how do you know," died unmuttered, and he refused to notice the words his daughter was voicing silently at her brother. He glanced at his wife's sardonically composed face, thought once more of the fire department and of other and larger and even more jealous, or would it be skeptical, government agencies, and clutched at the straw offered him. 10 minutes later he was quite unnecessarily assisting his son back through the bedroom window. "Gee, Pop, I couldn't see a sign of him. That's why I took so long. Hey, Pop, don't look so scared. He's in there, sure enough. It's just that the bathtub's under the window and you have to get real close up to see into it." "The Martian's taking a bath?" "Yep. Got it full up and just the end of his little old snozzle sticking out. Your suit pop was hanging on the door." The one word the professor's wife spoke was like a death knell. "Drowned?" "No, Ma, I don't think so. His schnozzle was opening and closing regular like." "Maybe he's a shape changer," the professor's coltish daughter said in a burst of evil fantasy. "Maybe he softens in water and thins out after a while until he's like a eel, and then he'll go exploring through the sewer pipes. Wouldn't it be funny if he went under the street and knocked on the stopper from underneath and crawled into the bathtub with President Rexford, or Mrs. President Rexford, or maybe right into the middle of one of Jamie Rexford's "Oh, I'm so sexy" bubble baths?" "Please." The professor put his hand to his eyebrow and kept it there, cuddling the elbow in his other hand. "Well, have you thought of something?" the professor's wife asked him after a bit. "What are you going to do?" The professor dropped his hand and blinked his eyes hard and took a deep breath. "Telegraph Fenchurch and Ankerly Ramsbottom, and then break in," he said in a resigned voice, into which, nevertheless, a note of hope seemed also to have come. "First, however, I'm going to wait until morning." And he sat down cross-legged in the hall a few yards from the bathroom door and folded his arms. So the long vigil commenced. The professor's family shared it, and he offered no objection. Other and sterner men, he told himself, might claim to be able successfully to order their children to go to bed when there was a Martian locked in the bathroom, but he would like to see them faced with the situation. Finally, dawn began to seep from the bedrooms. When the bulb in the hall had grown quite dim, the professor unfolded his arms. Just then, there was a loud splashing in the bathroom. The professor's family looked toward the door. The splashing stopped, and they heard the Martian moving around. Then the door opened, and the Martian appeared in the professor's gray pinstripe suit, his mouth curled sharply downward in a broad alien smile as he saw the professor. "Good morning," the Martian said happily. "I never slept better in my life, even in my own little wet bed back on Mars." He looked around more closely, and his mouth straightened. "But where did you all sleep?" he asked. "Don't tell me you stayed dry all night. You didn't give up your only bed to me?" His mouth curled upward in misery. "Oh, dear," he said. "I'm afraid I made a mistake somehow. Yet I don't understand how. Before I studied you, I didn't know what your sleeping habits would be. But that question was answered for me. In fact, it looked so reassuringly homelike when I saw those brief TV scenes of your females ready for sleep in their little tubs. Of course, on Mars, only the fortunate can always be sure of sleeping wet. But here, with your abundance of water, I thought there would be wet beds for all." He paused. "It's true, I had some doubts last night, wondering if I had used the right words and all. But then you rapped good night to me. I splashed the sentiment back at you and went to sleep in a wink. But I'm afraid that somewhere I've blundered and—" "No, no, dear chap," the professor managed to say. He had been waving his hand in a gentle circle for some time, in token that he wanted to interrupt. "Everything is quite all right. It's true we stayed up all night, but please consider that as a watch, an honor guard, by George, which we kept to indicate our esteem." End of What's He Doing in There by Fritz Leiber. This story was recorded by Phil Chenevert.